The United States of America was formed out of a blaze of revolution in the 18th century. Within 200 years, the nation reached the height of its power, emerging triumphant and robust following 2 world wars that devastated many other great nations. However, the history of this region stretches back further and is deeper. Most believe this is the history of the United States of America before its formation. The history of the continent claims diverse and intriguing evolution. The documented voyages and later death of Christopher Columbus paved the way for further Spanish and Portuguese expeditions, which were to reveal the existence of South America. With more accurate data and instruments at their disposal, references by mapmakers stated this was a new world. Our stories were told of this new world. Many people were intrigued and wanted to see for themselves. Therefore, the United States was to become a nation of immigrants filled with unwavering optimism and determination to succeed. However, before the settlement by Europeans and prior to explorers charting the coastlines, the continent was inhabited by various native communities. It is theorized the first people came by a land bridge that connected Russia to Alaska during the Ice Age. As the world temperature increased, the glaciers melted, raising the sea levels and thereby closing the land bridge. Over time, these first hunter-gatherers migrated throughout the continent and became the ancestors of all Native Americans. A variety of people, societies, languages, and cultures subsequently developed, most of which have been wiped out today. The land, climate, and nature were significant influences in the lives and beliefs of those who occupied it. One of the earliest societies was a Mississippi culture, where archaeology has established that they built raised cities and ceremonial burial mounds, with urban settlements sustained by a commendable trading network. In the Southwest, the Pueblos were known to construct complex, multi-story villages built out of stone. To the northeast, 5 and later 6 nations banded together to form the Iroquois Confederacy. They developed a centralized, democratic government comprised of representatives. It is argued that this confederacy was formed shortly before European contact by the peacemaker. However, the actual date is hearsay as no records exist. Perhaps the earliest noteworthy explorer was Leif Erikson, a Norse explorer who, during the 11th century, was blown off course en route to Greenland. This natural storm led to his discovery of the island, today known as Newfoundland, but the Norse name is Vinland. A settlement was constructed on the northern tip of the island, but the settlement proved not to be viable and quickly faded. During the 15th century, Europe was enjoying a safe passage, reaching to India and even as far as China. These trade routes along the Silk Road enabled sources of valuable goods, such as silks and spices, to be traded. With the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Empire, however, the land route to Asia became more difficult. Christopher Columbus was sponsored by Isabella of Castile and made his voyage with 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Arguably, it was the voyages and expeditions of Christopher Columbus that were a significant factor in the evolution of American history. Guided by the maps of Toscanelli, Columbus reached the Bahamas in 1492. He would undertake 3 more voyages, and as a reward for his success, he was appointed governor of Hispaniola. However, even for this time in history, Columbus committed multiple cruel and vile acts upon the natives, killing thousands to the point where he was later brought back to Europe and imprisoned. The most significant factor in the demise of the natives at the time, however, was disease. The natives had no immunity to the foreign diseases, and it is estimated that 90% of the population were wiped out. Over the following centuries, numerous European powers embarked on colonization efforts, seeking to exploit both the land and the resources and opportunities the continent offered. The Spanish focused their efforts on colonizing the Caribbean, Florida, and its conquest of the Aztec and Inca empires of South America. As news of this newfound continent reached Europe during the early 17th century, French immigrants were attracted to the fur trade and the wealth it could bring. They also had a desire to convert the natives to Catholicism and traveled further down the St. Lawrence River, laying the foundations for New France. The Dutch followed suit, establishing several forts, towns, and trading posts along the Hudson River, which provided a network of trade. New Netherland, as the colony was known, produced immense wealth for the Dutch. Other foreign nations began to envy the riches flowing out of the Hudson River Valley. The English settlers established a colony in Jamestown, Virginia, in 1607, which became a key exporter of tobacco. With tobacco plantations, the colony's need for labor became urgent. Indentured servants received paid passage to the Americas, along with food, clothing, and accommodation. Their contract was to work on plantations until the completion of their service. With the European arrival, the Iroquois Confederacy became increasingly involved in the fur trade. Dutch colonists and later English settlers craved the lucrative beaver furs, trading with the Iroquois in exchange for firearms. The Iroquois Confederacy depleted beaver populations in their homeland and mobilized against other tribes in the Great Lakes region who were allied with the French, all to gain access to new hunting and trapping grounds. The competitive nature of the fur trade led to decades of hostility and bloodshed among Native American tribes, who struggled to maintain and compete for relations with the colonies. In retaliation, the French invaded Iroquois villages and surrounding lands. Meanwhile, the Dutch lost New Netherland to the English during the Second Anglo-Dutch War, and New Amsterdam was renamed New York. The Beaver Wars, as it was called, ended with the Great Peace in 1701, in which the Iroquois Confederacy, the British, and the French agreed to stop their campaigns against tribes in the Ohio country and allowed the evicted tribes to return to their homeland. By the mid-17th century, European ships were sailing to Africa laden with goods which were to be traded for slaves. These slaves were transported in harsh conditions on crowded ships bound for the Americas, where they were forced to work on plantations. This resulted in increased productivity for plantation owners. Further trade ships embarked for Europe, where a hungry market awaited highly priced merchandise. By the mid-18th century, France had laid claim to a vast amount of territory, while the English territory had evolved into 13 colonies. The English colonies were much smaller in land area compared to New France. However, they had a larger population. In 1754, the French and Indian War broke out between Britain and France over disputed lands in the Ohio River Valley. France began the construction of forts in the region, and Britain sent troops to stop the construction, escalating the conflict into the 7 Years' War. A colonial war spread over several continents. The conflict ended in British victory, and large amounts of French territory in the New World were reassigned to Britain. However, following the 7 Years' War, the Crown amassed huge debts. In order to recoup the money, the British government imposed heavy taxes on the colonies. The first taxation was the Sugar Act, followed by the Stamp Act, where papers, magazines, and other documents needed to be produced in Britain and have a stamp tax on them. The colonists seriously disliked these taxes, voting protests, and boycotting British goods. They believed that there should be no taxation without representation in Parliament. The British were forced to revoke the Stamp Act due to the negative consequences for British businesses. Instead, they introduced new taxes on glass, tea, lead, and oil, which resulted in more protests, as these products were essential to the colonies. The Crown initially sent 1,000 troops to Boston to assert control. On March 5, 1770, conflict escalated when protesters started throwing stones and snowballs at the guards of the Custom House. In the skirmish, shots were fired, killing 5 protesters, an event that became known as the Boston Massacre. In 1773, disgusted by further taxation, American patriots known as the Sons of Liberty disguised themselves as Native American Indians. They boarded a British ship and began throwing tea cargo into the harbor. The British Crown, driven with anger, sent 4,000 more troops to Boston, concluding with direct British rule. The British controlled Boston, but the Americans controlled the countryside and began arming and training militias known as the Minutemen. In 1774, The First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia. 56 delegates from 12 colonies arrived to discuss the reduction of taxes and a response to the intolerable acts when Massachusetts had been stripped of self-government by the British Parliament. They sent a message to Britain, and they responded with more regulations and increased army presence. Massachusetts was declared in a state of rebellion. British Commander Lieutenant General Thomas Gage was ordered to disarm the rebels and arrest their leaders. On the night of the 18th of April, 1775, Paul Revere rode ahead of British forces to warn leaders that the British were coming. American militias met the British forces at Lexington, retreated back to Concord, and with more troops arriving, they overwhelmed the British, who retreated back to Boston, where the city came under siege. At the Second Continental Congress, the militias were reorganized to form the Continental Army, and they appointed General George Washington as leader. British reinforcements arrived, led by General William Howe. The Battle of Bunker Hill saw victory for the British, but the price they paid was a substantial loss of life, and Boston remained under siege. General George Washington arrived in Boston the following month and continued the siege through autumn and winter. In March 1776, artillery arrived, and General George Washington ordered them to overlook the city, forcing the British to evacuate. Thomas Jefferson drafted the official Declaration of Independence, and the final text was approved on July 4, 1776. A year later, they fashioned the Articles of Confederation, which served as its first constitution. Meanwhile, the rebels were waging a full-scale war for their independence. France and Spain began to support their efforts by sending supplies and weapons. Washington had moved his army to New York, and as expected, the British arrived with 130 warships and 25,000 troops. The war continued with victories and defeats on both sides. The American victory at Saratoga would prove to be a turning point for the American Revolution, as it prompted France and later Spain to go to war openly on the side of the Americans. With French assistance, the Continental Army forced the British to surrender at Yorktown. The Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, recognizing the independence of the United States and ceding all land up to the Mississippi River. The U.S. Constitution was drafted in 1787 and ratified in 1788, launching the United States system of government and fundamental laws. It was followed by the Bill of Rights, namely the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, guaranteeing basic rights for citizens. The United States of America was now an independent country, with George Washington appointed as the first president in 1789. Having supported the Americans, France amassed substantial debt, which was a major catalyst of the French Revolution. Following the Revolution, the United States refused to honor the debt owed to France, as they believed it arose from a previous regime. France was annoyed that the United States was trading with Britain while war continued to rage between them. The U.S. strengthened its navy as France continued to attack and raid U.S. merchant ships, leading to the Quasi-War, the Undeclared War. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson purchased French Louisiana from Napoleon at a bargain price of $15 million, doubling the size of the United States. Napoleon had won back this territory from Spain in 1800, but war with Britain was inevitable. Rather than witness the territory fall into British hands, he sold the territory to fund his military campaigns. Following the deal, President Thomas Jefferson commissioned an expedition to explore the newly purchased land. The mission was led by a group of U.S. Army volunteers under the command of Captain Lewis and his close friend, Second Lieutenant Clark. They studied the animal life, the region's geography, established diplomatic relations, and trade with many indigenous nations, and reported back with maps, sketches, and journals. The War of 1812 between Britain and the United States didn't see any significant territorial changes. However, the British Canadians were successful in burning down the White House. During the 1830s, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, which enforced the extradition of many Native American tribes in the southern states to relocate to reservations. While en route, many natives contracted diseases, and starvation killed thousands, an event becoming known as the Trail of Tears. The U.S. continued to grow and expand under the idea of manifest destiny, a belief that the United States was destined to expand across to the Pacific. Mexico gained independence from Spain in 1821 with a sparsely populated northern territory, and the Mexican government welcomed settlers from the United States to further develop the region. Unlike the mainly Catholic Mexican population, many of the new settlers were Protestant pro-slavery and patriotic to the United States.